You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
Everybody I ever have met who's successful in this business has, just a half dozen or a dozen or more than a dozen projects going simultaneously, because you know that most of the projects you're working on are never going to actually see the light of day. So you've got to have a lot of projects sort of in the hopper. You're pushing all these projects forward, and you're just hoping that one of them actually does take off.
Hey everyone, thanks again for hitting that play button. It's another episode of the Dave Bullis Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Bullis, a fellow filmmaker, screenwriter, and guy just trying to navigate through this crazy thing called life. So I got my new laptop sitting here. I want to say thank you to my friend Rudy Kessler of Kessler Comics for pointing me in the direction of this deal. I will actually post it in the show notes as well in case anybody else is interested. I also want to say, as a friendly reminder, if you enjoy this episode, please share. I want to say thank you to everyone who keeps sharing these episodes. Lately, I've been getting a lot more shares on Facebook and Twitter, and that really, really helps us all out in the long run. Because the more people that can find out about this podcast, the more guests I can get, and it just sort of keeps feeding itself. I also want to say thank you to everyone for wishing me luck in the NYC Midnight Screenwriting Challenge. By the time this is up, I will have submitted the assignment for round 1. And I won't know until a few weeks if I make it to round 2, so hopefully I will, because it'd be pretty damn cool to win this thing. But I'm going to be talking to a screenwriter on this episode of the podcast. On this episode of the Dave Bullis Podcast, my guest is a professional screenwriter and host of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. He just raised over $14,000 on Kickstarter for his directorial debut, The Pinch, a feature film which he also wrote. So here it is, episode 108. With guest Ashley Scott Meyers.
You're listening to the Dave Bullis Podcast.
Hey, Ashley, thanks a lot for coming on the show.
Thank you, Dave. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, my pleasure, my friend. So, Ashley, it's a question I always ask to everyone, and I wanted to ask you the same question. Basically, that is, when you were growing up, did you oftentimes, did you always dabble in filmmaking? Did you always know you wanted to do this? And, so what brought you, to the film industry?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, and part of it is hindsight, like when you're a kid, you don't really realize sort of the full scope of what's going on in your life. But especially, I had an older brother. He was maybe 20 months older than me. So we were very much impacted by movies. And, we grew up in the 80s. So it was all Star Wars and Indiana Jones. And so I definitely really did have a great love of movies. My dad had one of these 8mm film cameras, and we got that out, and we were going to try and I don't even really remember the thought process, but we were going to film our own version of Indiana Jones with the neighborhood kids. And so we got a bunch of kids together, and that was actually I remember I wrote this script on the bus home from school one day. I wrote basically a short 10-page version of the original Indiana Jones movie into a 10-page short. And my parents have since moved, so I don't know if I could still find it, but one of the years I went back to my parents' old house, and it was still sitting in the bottom, of my bookshelf there. So I definitely think I was always sort of interested in it. But, as a kid, you don't really think about what you really want to do. And I grew up in Annapolis, Maryland. So there was no sort of precedent. I didn't know any filmmakers. I didn't even know anyone who knew anyone. It was in Annapolis, Maryland, it's the doctors and the lawyers are basically kind of that sort of upper tier of society. So there were no artists. I took classical guitar at one point, and, this woman that would teach me that was sort of my impression of what an artist was. She was a really nice lady and very talented, guitarist and teacher, but, she didn't make a lot of money. It was kind of a struggle, and her husband was sort of similar. They were artists. So my impression of sort of artists and creative people was sort of like that, sort of the struggling teacher model. So I never really knew that this was something, I never really thought that this was something that maybe was realistic. And I've told this story on my own podcast, but at one point in college, and I was an accounting major, so I had really no aspirations in the film industry, but I was waiting to go into an economics class, and across the hall was the poetry reading room, and I went in there, and one of the books was Writer's Digest, Writer's Market, and I opened it up, and again, this is in the mid-90s, so quite a while ago now, but I opened it up, but it was in the mid-90s. The point is that that was before email and sort of before the World Wide Web had really caught on. So I opened up this book, and they had a section on screenwriting, and I just, there was like maybe 100 companies listed, and, send your query letter here, accepts unsolicited material. So I just wrote like 10 pages of what I thought was brilliant script, and picked 2 companies that seemed especially open to unproduced writers. And back then you would include a self-addressed stamp postcard. So I just wrote up 10 pages of my script, sent it to them. I don't even think I included a query letter. I don't even remember. And again, keep in mind, this was sort of before you could just download scripts. So I had no real idea how to format a script, because at this point I had never read a script. So one of the responses on the self-addressed stamp postcard was, thank you for that undated, untitled submission. No thanks. But the other one, and I just thanked this guy, and I can't really remember his name. I've tried to remember and look him up, and I've never been able to do it. But he actually called me. I guess I must have included my phone number in the submission. And he actually just called me and said, listen, don't do this anymore. Go and read Sid Field's Screenplay. That will at least get you sort of the basics. And it just had never occurred to me. I'm like, in college, so I just don't have that much worldly experience. It just had never occurred to me to like walk down to the local bookshop and look through the filmmaking section and pick up a book on screenwriting. So I eventually did that through his advice. And then, this is again, maybe junior year in college, and I really didn't like accounting, so I wasn't going to go be an accountant. So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to pack it in and go to LA when I get there. So it's kind of a long-winded answer, but yeah, I do think that I always sort of thought that being a screenwriter and being a writer would be a cool thing, but I just didn't understand how that would even work. So I was hesitant to get involved. But once I saw this writer's market with some actual production companies and some listings and some little things like we'll accept unsolicited material, just that to me was the motivation, the sort of the aha moment where I said, okay, so if I write something, then I can actually potentially meet some people and sell some people. And just knowing and having those addresses it was very empowering to me, because it wasn't interesting to me to just write a script when I had no idea of what to do with it once I was done. But once I had some even vague notion of what to do with it, that inspired me, and I started to actually write. I just started to write scripts. And, before I even moved to LA, I think I had, in that time, between junior year and moving to LA, let's say a year and a half later, I think I wrote 2 or 3 full feature-length scripts. So, I was sort of off to the races, let's say.
So did you actually end up picking up Sid Field's book on screenwriting?
I did. It took a while. I went to college in Greensboro, North Carolina. I went to the local bookstore, and I could not find it. But there was another book on screenwriting that I got, and I don't even remember what it was, but it was not Sid Field. And then on spring break, I was on the tennis team, and on spring break, we were down in Florida. And so I just started going to every bookstore I would see and see if they had this Sid Field book. And again, this is the mid-'90s. I don't know. Maybe things have changed. Now there's no bookstores left anymore, but I would just go to bookstores that I would see. And on this trip during spring break, I just started stopping at a bunch of bookstores. And so I did eventually find Sid Field. In fact, I didn't. I found Sid Field's, his second book, which is like the Sid Field screenwriting workbook or something. And so I found his second book and actually read that. And it's kind of, it's very similar to the first book. So I eventually found the first book, but I'm not sure when that was, but the first book I actually got was not Sid Field. The second book was the Sid Field book, but it wasn't Sid Field's screenplay. And then eventually I did get to the Sid Field screenplay book.
So when you were writing all those different screenplays, you weren't really following anyone's sort of, guidelines or advice or anything. You were just sort of, basically.
And I still have some of those scripts in my drawer. One of them was called Midlife Comedy. It was a play on midlife crisis. And it was this, sort of treatise on, what happens in a midlife crisis. And of course, keep in mind, I'm like a 21-year-old kid writing this. So I really had absolutely no perspective on a midlife crisis at that point. No structure, no nothing. It was just me with just typing into a computer and formatting it as best I could, using whatever word processing program was available to me.
Well, I actually think that's refreshing that you wrote that, because usually, you write what you know, And usually, you know, those screenplays end up being, you know, a guy like 21, 22, whatever. And, you know, he meets a girl, loses a girl. And it's, I mean, how many of those screenplays do you think are written?
Yeah, a lot. And yeah, I run my SYS forum, and yeah, I see a lot of pitches from people, and yeah, there is a lot of those. I think everybody has those in their system, and you definitely have to get them out. But those are tough scripts to sell, man.
Yeah, now I just said that I actually do have one of those myself that I will probably, you know, end up sending under a pseudonym someday. That way, if they ever hate it, they're like, well, this guy sucks. It's not like. You know, but yeah, I completely, you know, agree with what you just said. You know, I think everyone does have one of those inside them. And, you know, and it's just sort of finding love, losing love, finding love again. Yeah.
So, in fact, the first script I ever sold, now that I'm sort of thinking about it, it was pretty much that script. It was a script called Dish Dogs, and it was basically two guys. They were sort of just graduated college, and they were driving around the country working as dishwashers and, you know, going to strip clubs and meeting girls and all those things that you just mentioned, you know, find love, lose love. So I did actually sell one of those, and I wrote a few more of them, which I did not sell. So I guess there is something. This script was pretty high on the comedy. So I think, you know, it's billed as a comedy, not necessarily sort of a dramedy. I think a lot of these scripts end up being dramedies, and that's where you really run into problems trying to sell it.
So, you know, actually, you said, you mentioned you went out to L.A., you realized, you know, the whole accounting thing wasn't going to work out for you. You know, when you finally got out to L.A., you know, what was it like? You know, did you have a place to stay? Did you have any connections? Anything? You know, I'm always interested in people who just, you know, make that entire move to go out to LA.
So I had a buddy in college, and he was actually an economics major, and we were both terrible students. So, you know, not only was I not going to be an accountant because I didn't want to be, nobody would have hired me as an accountant because my grades were so terrible. So it wasn't as though I was, you know, I mean, and my friend was in a similar situation. It's not like he had good grades and, you know, he wouldn't have gotten any kind of a good job. So we just said, let's just go to LA. We didn't know anybody. And, literally for $500, again, this was now 20 years ago, but for $500, he bought a 1958 Ford pickup truck, and we packed all our stuff in that and drove from, you know, basically my house in Maryland at the time down to North Carolina where he lived, and then all the way across the country on Route 40. And we didn't know anybody. The one thing I'll say, the night before we left North Carolina, his parents' house in North Carolina, we had dinner with one of his parents' friends, and this friend was a musician, and he had spent a lot of time in LA. So he gave us some just really like good advice. And I think that advice still holds up today. He said, go to North Hollywood, that Studio City, North Hollywood area. It's pretty centrally located, and it will be a lot cheaper. And that, I still think that that's really sound advice. And that's pretty much all he said to us. And so we just had our map of LA, and we just circled, you know, that Studio City, North Hollywood area. So we just drove across the country. When we got here, we actually camped out in Malibu, just found a campsite in Malibu, stayed there one night, and the next morning drove in to just this area in Studio City in North Hollywood. And we ended up living in a place called Valley Village, which is kind of like a little subsection of North Hollywood. And I think that's just great practical advice. It's a pretty good location. You can get around the city of LA pretty well from that area, and it's going to be much cheaper than places like Santa Monica or, you know, some of the trendy places like Silver Lake. So that was the advice we got, and that's what we did. And we didn't know anybody. We didn't have jobs. We had a little bit of money in the bank, and when I say a little bit, we're talking like, you know, $2,000 was our, you know, that's basically what we saved over our summer jobs. So we had like $2,000, and we basically just started going from apartment to apartment. Any apartment that had a vacancy sign, we would go to it and knock on the door. And we found, you know, most of the people would not rent to us because we had no jobs and we just had no even job prospects. But we found a Russian guy. He was the apartment manager. He said, go down and talk to the woman who's the owner of the building, and maybe she'll rent to you. And she had another apartment building where she had her office just a couple blocks away. So we drove down there and met with her, and she sized us up, and she said, okay, I'll rent with you. And we gave her first month and last month, and we gave her a security deposit, which was like another month's rent. So we had to put down a little bit of money. Again, we had life savings. We were so fresh out of college, neither one of us had any credit. We didn't have good credit or bad credit. So I don't even remember if they ran our credit, but if they did, there was nothing either one of us had really done, good or bad. So we were just able to, we were nice enough, I guess, looking that this woman just thought we had, we enough initiative to go get jobs and actually pay the rent. So she was nice enough to rent to us. But I think that's just kind of the hustle. But no, we didn't know anybody when we first got here.
So what jobs did you find when you got there?
So yeah, my buddy, he just started, he got a job. I mean, he just opened up, and I would say he's probably more industrious than I was. He just opened up the want ads. And again, back then it was sort of before the internet. So back then it was just a newspaper, and he just got a job selling cars, and he hated it. And it was a terrible job. But literally just selling cars at a local car lot. And I had played tennis in college. So I just went around to all the local tennis clubs and just said, hey, do you need anybody for anything? I figured at least I could meet some people to play tennis with. And so that was really my first job. And it was actually the Toluca Lake Tennis Club. And it was not a bad place to be for someone who just rolled into LA, because a lot of the members, Toluca Lake is kind of sort of right next to sort of Burbank. It's sort of sandwiched between really North Hollywood and Burbank. And so it's not a bad place. And this tennis club was right across from the Warner Brothers lot, literally across the LA River from the Warner Brothers lot. And so a lot of the members were working filmmakers. And I wouldn't say there was anybody particularly famous, but there was a working actor here and a working cinematographer, and there were just some industry people, some people that were screenwriters, writers, and so and I just worked at the front desk. My job was not particularly good, but it wasn't a bad job. Because I just could meet these people, and everybody, oh, well, what do you do? I mean, everyone kind of knows, a punk kid fresh out of college working at the reception desk at a tennis club. They know I'm either an actor, a writer, or a director, and so you strike up these conversations. And people were very nice. They would pass me their scripts or any scripts that they would get. So I would read a lot of scripts, and they would give me advice, and just got to sort of know some of the people that were working in the industry. So it wasn't a bad job, but it was minimum wage, or maybe just a little above minimum wage. So it wasn't a great job financially, but it wasn't a bad place to be. And I was there for, a year or two, basically just working that.
It's funny. I was actually reading an article by Richard Linklater, and he had a job similar to that, except it was at a hotel, and he would use that time to read screenplays or, write screenplays and stuff like that. And he ended up getting fired when he had to pick up like a boss, and he was telling the boss, yeah, I basically do nothing, it's blah, blah. And the boss, he said was busy complaining about the competition. But then like a week later, he got a notification like, oh, your job's done. Pack up your bags. Then he realized maybe he shouldn't have said all those things.
So, and there was definitely some downtime. It was working the front desk, so there would be busy times. But I don't know that I ever wrote actual script pages. I might have, but I do remember kind of like working on my query letters, my log lines. I do remember reading scripts and that kind of stuff. So it was, as I said, it wasn't a bad job for someone that was kind of trying to get into the industry.
I find having those jobs where you have those downtimes actually is a little more beneficial. I mean, because, like your friend selling those cars, I imagine he probably didn't have a lot of downtime to sort of write, did he?
No, you're exactly right. And it was brutal work. So he would just come home exhausted, and he didn't have any interest in doing a lot of other stuff. So you've definitely got to find that job. When you're starting out, find that job that, does give you a little bit of flexibility and is not mentally draining.
Yes, that is, I find out the key. I mean, in the podcast, I've done with you, I was discussing that my day job was literally killing me. Like I'd come home, and I would be beat, and I wouldn't want to do anything. I just want to play some video games and then call it a night, or I'd watch a movie and then call it a night, because I was just beat because it was working IT all day, getting yelled at for why their computer won't turn on, or doing multimedia work, doing event work. I mean, because my job was combination of a lot of things. So I completely understand where your friend was, where it was just like, I don't feel like doing anything.
Yeah. So I think that's good advice for screenwriters, is to try and find that job that isn't mentally draining.
Yes. Because you're still out in LA. So, before I want to talk about, about your writing practices and how you write, I wanted to ask Ashley, what advice would you give to somebody moving out to LA, right now?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think there's the practical considerations, and I think I kind of covered that. I think North Hollywood, Valley Village, Studio City, I think that's a good location to roll into. And then I think just networking. The other thing I did, and my buddy did this too, the other thing we did when we first got here, and I can't believe that similar systems don't exist. But I'm not necessarily up on it, but I did extra work. And again, it was low paid, long hours, but it was fairly easy. So you could bring scripts. There's a lot of sitting around when you're doing extra. So you can read scripts, and writing might be a little dicey, but you can definitely read scripts and just being on the set. So that's another thing that I did when I first got here that I would highly recommend. And it just you can get without too much difficulty. And again, back then it was, I think it was Senex Casting and Central Casting, and you might be able to Google them and look it up. And you just get in their system, and then at least back then, maybe it's online now. Back then it was just calling the phone number, and they would basically list what they're looking for, and then you would just say, hey, I'm here, I'm available tomorrow, whenever the date is. But we got on some pretty big movies back then. Space Jam was the big Michael Jordan movie. There was a bunch of big movies filming, and it was pretty easy just to get on there. And it was interesting just being on those sets. Like, again, a guy that's never done any filmmaking, grew up in Maryland, never even seen a film get shot. I was an accounting major. So I really had no sort of on-set experience. And it was just interesting just being an extra and getting that. So I think that's sort of maybe my first level, is just try and get out here and just spend the first year or so just doing some interesting things like that. Try and write as much as you can, but I wouldn't beat yourself up too much if you don't do a lot of writing that first year. Get a lay of the land, do some fun stuff, get some interesting jobs, and meet people. And then, after a while, I would say after a year of that, you probably do then want to really start focusing on the writing. And I think that's really, pretty much every writer is going to tell you the most important thing you can do as a writer is to write. So I think that would probably be my single biggest advice. Once you kind of get your feet on the ground, you've got to write a lot of material. And I'm just a big believer, and some of this is a big numbers game. So, writing one script and just spending all your time tweaking it and honing it and trying to make it perfect, at some point you've got to move on, and you've got to get another script going and another script going and another script going, so that every script you have done, it's another potential networking opportunity, another potential sale. And the more scripts you have that you can send out, it just increases your odds. With every script that you write that's polished and ready to go out, it increases your odds that you're going to actually make a sale. And everybody I ever have met who's successful in this business has, just a half dozen or a dozen or more than a dozen projects going simultaneously, because that most of the projects you're working on are never going to actually see the light of day. So you've got to have a lot of projects sort of in the hopper. You're pushing all these projects forward, and you're just hoping that one of them actually does take off.
So you did mention, about spending a year finally the land and then actually having to start write, because, like you said, the best writing advice is just to write. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about your writing sort of habits, and I want to talk about, how you actually write. Actually, do you sort of, wake up in the morning and it's the first thing you do, or, and you sort of lock yourself away in your office and you sort of, do you outline a lot? I want to sort of get into the nitty gritty of, how your day is structured.
Yeah, selling your screenplay definitely takes a considerable time. I have a bunch of other websites that I also run, and so that does take some time. But primarily, as far as my screenwriting, I do try and do all my screenwriting in the morning. I feel like I am a morning person, and I feel like just mentally, I'm at my best in the morning, and so I'm creatively the best in the morning. So I try and do that in the morning for an hour or two. If I'm writing a spec script, I would say I spend an hour or two in the morning, pretty much as early as I can get there. My sort of routine, I have 2 young children, so they usually wake up around 6:37. So we have breakfast, and then, by 7:30, I'm usually at my desk. So I'll write for an hour or 2 hours. So that takes me 7:30, 8:30, 9:30, something like that. Now, I've had some writing assignments where people are paying me to write, and, then you've got deadlines and you do have to step it up. The deadlines are always much tighter than what I would ever do with a spec script. So when I get a writing assignment, I probably am spending, depending on what it is, but, more like half the day. I might spend half the day writing. And again, I try and do it in the morning. So hopefully by lunchtime, from like 7:30 to say 12:30, spend those hours writing and then handle my other stuff in the afternoon. But if the deadline is tight enough, then yeah, I will just write all day. I'm a firm believer, and I chronicled this on my podcast. In September, I did have a writing assignment, and the producer literally wanted the script in 6 days, a full-length feature script in 6 days. And so I had basically like Monday, we're on the phone negotiating the deal. He gives me an outline. So I basically had Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to get him a draft. And my weekends are pretty well booked with my family, my kids. So I don't have a lot of time on the weekends to spend. So essentially I had 4 days to produce at least a first draft. And that's kind of what I did. So then obviously you're just pounding through it 12 or 14 hours a day. And then sometimes that's just what it takes. I'm not someone that has a big problem writing terrible pages. And maybe it hurts me in some regards, but I'm not a perfectionist. So, writing 20 or 30 terrible pages in a day, I can do it. I think I even might have had a day where I did over 30 pages in that 4-day span. I mean, that script was a 90-page script, and I wrote it in basically 4 days. So you can do the math on that. But once I got going, I think I wrote like 30, 40 pages on those last 2 days. Sometimes you just have to pound through it and not, you're not going to be inspired every moment of your writing career. Sometimes it's just a matter of just knuckling down and doing the work.
So when you had to write that first draft that quickly, I imagine there was no time to hit that backspace button, so to speak, or second guess. I mean, literally you had to hit the pedal to the metal and just grab that idea and sort of run with it.
That's exactly right. And that's really the key is you just make a decision for better or for worse. You try and do the best you can, but you don't have time to like mull your decisions over. So you just have to make a decision and go with it and, hope that it's a good decision. So yeah, you're not going backwards. You're not questioning what you've done. You just are constantly just sitting at the key and keyboard. And the key, you turn off Facebook, you turn off email, you turn off Twitter, you just close those browser windows. So all you have open is, Final Draft, and you just keep writing. And every time you stop writing, you just remind yourself, keep writing. I would use a little time clock too, where I would give myself like a 5-minute break to like mull something over. And I would just set my iPhone, just do a little timer for 5 minutes. And I would just mull something over for 5 minutes and then, just make the best decision I could. And then boom, back at it and try and write. And as I said, you can write a feature film script in 4 days if you really have to. And I think it turned out pretty well. And the irony is, a lot of times as writers, we spend a lot of time. We might spend 6 months or a year on a script. Like I can pretty much tell you, I could send you that script or one of the scripts that took me 6 months to write. And, some people are going to like the one I wrote in 4 days better than the one I wrote in 6 months. You're going to get no consensus. It's not like the one that you write in 4 days is really that much worse than the one that took six months. So truthfully, it's brutal work. I mean, those are a brutally hard 4 days, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. But truthfully, I think there's something to that. Just getting stuff done quickly and pushing through it is not a bad way to write a script.
I think that the fear or the want is maybe a better word for perfectionism is what holds a lot of people back. So they sort of, write a few pages and then they delete it. And then they're back, they're sort of playing this back and forth game. And then they sort of hit this valley where they're like, why the hell did I start this project in the first place? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I don't know if your audience is familiar with Seth Godin. He's a very famous internet marketer. And one of his books is called The Dip. And it applies to precisely what you just said. When you conceive of a project, there's this initial burst of energy and excitement. And, once you start writing, there is this thing, the dip. And this Seth Godin is applying it to, business ideas, but really any idea that you have. It's like you think of this idea and you think it's great, but once you start to execute that idea, that's when it really becomes hard and you go through this dip. And one of the keys is understanding that and not letting that kind of take over your writing process, understanding that there's going to be this dip before you get to the dip, so that when you're in the dip, you understand that you have to just keep pushing forward in order to get over the dip, or past the dip. So I think and some of that just is coming with experience. Believe me, those 4 days, as I said, when I'm writing the script, I'm looking at this thinking this is just the worst thing in the world, and you just feel absolutely terrible, and they're just brutally hard days. But again, I have done this enough that I knew if I just kept going, it would be okay. And, it would be okay in less than 5 days. I'd be fine. And I was. So
when you handed in that draft, did you have to do further iterations?
Yeah, we did do some further iterations on it. There was definitely some more rewriting, but he wanted a pretty solid first draft that he could start to cast and start to get some locations. It was kind of a long story. He had some sort of things in place. He was going to do another movie that fell through, so he had a bunch of things in place and was like, listen, I need a script in 6 days because we've already got like the production machine going, and for a variety of reasons, the project ended up falling apart after that. I still hear from him occasionally. He's like, oh, no, I'm still working on this. But it didn't end up, in hindsight, he didn't really need a script in 6 days. We could have taken 6 months to write it. But yeah, there was probably another month of rewrites as he kind of went into pre-production with it. But those were pretty minor. Truthfully, the first draft was actually not that bad. And I probably, let's just say I spent 12 hours a day for 4 days, and then I probably spent 2 or 3 hours a day that Saturday and Sunday doing a polish. So I bet I didn't spend more than about another 20 or 30 hours total doing all the iterations. So the bulk of the work was done in those 4 days.
I mean, and that's still such an impressive, endeavor to do because, sometimes when I sit down to write, Ashley, I just get bogged down with perfectionism, and it just becomes, you know what I mean? And it's sort of in your mind, and I'm sure this has happened to you and other writers listening, you sort of think in your mind, and by the end you're like, man, this seems like an unclimbable mountain. You know what I mean? And you're right, and you're right about Seth Godin and the dip. When you hit that plateau, you're like, why the hell did I start this project? Where did I go wrong in life? And you sort of wonder what how you got to here and how you can get out. Sort of like the only way out is through. Yeah,
exactly.
Right?
And it helps with experience, especially if you're on a writing assignment. It is what it is, and so sometimes there's not that much wiggle room. But with a spec script, I do think, and again, just us talking about it and having other screenwriters listen to it, I do think that is part of the process is understanding that there's going to be this dip. And so it also makes you more cautious about what ideas you actually try and write. And so you take a step back and say, well, is this an idea that I'm going to be able to get through the dip on? And sometimes that's a good thing. You quit before you start. And sometimes that's a good thing. It makes you a little bit more conscientious that this is going to be quite a bit of work. It's not going to be easy to get that thing through, no matter how great you think that idea is. And again, part of it's just experience. It's just going through that process a number of times and realizing that, hey, this really is going to be hard. But again, I think understanding that and that can help you not waste a lot of times on bad ideas. Maybe you spend more time vetting your ideas, and then once you commit, you commit and you can get through that dip because you've spent the time sort of thinking that through.
Yeah, that is I was actually just reading an article too about screenwriting because again, that seems to be all I do anymore is read articles and attend seminars. But there was an article that said 95% of screenwriting is problem solving. And, I forget who the author was. I know it's, bad on my part, but it was just, it was kind of, I think they kind of hit the nail on the head, which is something I've said in my podcast before, where a lot of this is, problem solving. If I change one thing here in the story, well, that affects 10 other things. You know what I mean? But if I do this affects 5 other things. So it's sort of, finding sort of that right balance when we're writing. Almost finding that idea, like you said, for better or for worse, that we find, and then we sort of just go with that.
Yeah. And I would even go further. I mean, 95% problem solving. I might say it's 99% problem solving. I mean, it's almost all problem solving. Like what I found with screenwriters, most of the people who end up at my site, sellingyourscreenplay.com, most of those people, they've written a script or two, and now they're trying to figure out how to market it. So those are sort of the people that I interact with. And, the vast majority of those people are, intelligent people, and they can put words down on page. And I think, there are some people that have a flair for writing, like their writing is it has just sort of a flair. But I honestly don't know that is that important with screenwriting. I think it's more about what you're talking about, the decision making, and that happens before you actually start writing final draft. And, even if you're not a super, like even if you don't have a super flair, like you're a wordsmith and your writing has real sort of pizzazz, if it's just laid out in a very straightforward manner and you spend that 99% of the time really thinking things through, it will be well plotted. The characters will be dimensional, all of these things. As I said, even if you don't necessarily have a flair with words, I think you can still do okay as a screenwriter and succeed. So as I said, I would even go further. It's like almost all decision making.
Yeah, that is something that I found out as well. I will link to that article, by the way, in the show notes, everyone, because that sort of hit the nail on the head what I was trying to say in previous podcasts, because I always thought, that is, as we're going through, as we're brainstorming concepts, as we're brainstorming or outlining, it's what we're doing. Why would this person do this? How will we get here? And just sort of, just by going from that external story, that's what we're trying to figure out is, why would these characters do these things? Because, it has to make sense. It has to make sense on the surface. But, Ashley, you and I could talk screenwriting all day, and, but I want to get to your podcast. You have a podcast, which is Selling Your Screenplay podcast. What was the impetus of you starting your own podcast?
I just, I listened to, before I started my podcast, I listened to a lot of podcasts, and I just really thought it was a great medium. I had a friend in Script Dr. Eric, and that was sort of my first exposure to actually doing a podcast. He was a script analysis, and he started doing a podcast, and he had me on one day, and it was really just fun to do. Again, not unlike what we're doing now. We just kind of talked shop. It was very conversational, and it wasn't, I could see from what he was doing, it wasn't a huge technical challenge. And I was running sellingyourscreenplay.com, which, I sell services to screenwriters. So I listened to a lot of podcasts. I saw that it didn't seem overwhelming as a technical challenge to produce this thing and get it going. And it seemed like something that I could network with other filmmakers and potentially producers and just get to know a bunch of people. So it just seemed like a really good fit for kind of what I was doing. And again, on the sort of the back end, I thought it would be a good marketing piece for sellingyourscreenplay.com, but it sort of fit, my skill set and my interests and my talents. It just kind of fit like all the check boxes. And I'm still very, bullish on podcasting as a medium. I think it's only going to grow more. I think there's still a lot of people that you talk to who just don't understand what a podcast is or how it works. And that's going to change, as more people get into it. I think we've got a long, like right now, it seems like, it's kind of a crowded space, but I don't think it's anything compared to what we're going to see, in 5 or 10 years. I think it's a great industry to be in.
I absolutely agree. On John Lee Dumas's podcast, he's waiting for the smart cars where you can, it's an autonomous ride, but you say to your car, hey, what are the top 5 filmmaking podcasts? And on the display, it'll show you what the top 5 are based on analytics. And you could say, I want to listen to Selling Your Screenplay podcast, or I want to listen to the Indie Film Hustle by Alex Ferrari podcast. And you would listen to the podcast as the car drives you to where you want to go. Yeah. And I mean, we're probably, about what do you think? 5 years from that? At most?
Exactly. And these things always seem to take longer than you think, but yeah, I totally agree. And, it can only increase. And I just think, it's just a great medium. That's just all I can say. So I just felt like it was a great medium. I mean, it's like, I think the people at XM Radio, those are the folks that I think should be really concerned. And my own example, like I had XM Radio in my car, but once I started listening to podcasts, it was like, just cancel it. Why am I paying $10 a month for something that I never listened to? These podcasts are much more interesting than any selection of music that they're ever gonna throw at me through XM Radio. And Apple has done a pretty good job with their the iTunes store and being able to download podcasts. So it's really pretty easy to do. So I'm just very bullish. I think 10 years down the road, it's just going to be a totally different landscape, and there's going to be a gazillion podcasts.
I have Sirius in my car as well. It came free with the car. If and I do listen to some stations, but at least with that, it lets you, you're not just stuck with one thing. You can actually go through and find different things. It's not completely there like it would be a podcast, because then you have complete control. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think the podcast landscape is just going to only increase. I mean, there's friends of mine on Facebook who every once in a while will chime me and be like, "Hey, we're going to start we're starting my own podcast. What should we buy? What mic should we get?" And I'm like, okay. And I created a blog post for that, by the way, just so that way I can always send people to that and be like, there you go. But I mean, that's great though that you actually started it as an extension of sellingyourscreenplay.com, because I think that works well on a lot of different levels too. And, like I said, I found you because I was on a podcasting app and I searched, screenwriting, and yours was the number one search that came up.
Yeah. And that's the other thing. I think, if you have any kind of a business that like screenwriting, I mean, there's so many, there's so much skepticism, and I don't even know that is necessarily justified, but there's so much skepticism among screenwriters, and probably in a lot of industry, but there's just skepticism like, well, is this guy real? Is this product really going to be, all it's hyped up to be? And I think podcasting is an excellent way to, really just get to know someone. I mean, I would listen to these podcasts, and after a while you feel like you know the person, and you can kind of tell who are the salesy, sleazy people. You can kind of hear it in their voice. And so it is a real legitimate way to kind of hear someone and understand kind of what they're about, and then ultimately decide if their products are a good fit for kind of what you're looking for. So for any business really, but I think it's especially good for something like myself that's selling screenwriting products.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I concur. And also, you actually just completed a successful Kickstarter campaign for your feature film.
I did, and I'm knee deep now in pre-production, and it's a lot of work. And I did successfully run the Kickstarter campaign, and it's definitely going to be a micro budget feature film. The total budget's around $25,000. So I've done, as I said, I've sold a bunch of scripts in my career. Had a bunch of writing assignments. So I've definitely had sort of a career as a screenwriter. I would say every production, it's almost inversely proportional. For the more money I've made with a screenplay, the less creatively fulfilling the process has been. And so that's really what inspired me to do this. I said, you know what, I'm going to go out, I'm going to raise the money. And I did this Kickstarter. I'm throwing in a bunch of my own money to get it to the 25,000, and then I'm just going to produce it. I've never produced a film quite in this way. I've been sort of like an executive producer or maybe a co-producer on a project, but I've never actually been the lead producer. So I am being the lead producer. I'm directing it. Obviously, I wrote the script. So that's what I'm gearing up for. And the shoot dates are July 9th to July 29th here in LA.
And that's awesome, because, when I was doing crowdfunding, it was a couple years ago when I started, and you had to keep repeating, what crowdfunding was. And that's when I saw you were running this campaign, that's when I actually thought I'd reach out and say hi and, finally introduce myself. But, I was actually happy. I'm like, wow, I'm glad this guy's, crowdfunding campaign actually was a success. Because you have a built-in audience. You have the podcast, you have your site. I mean that's phenomenal. And one of the benefits of crowdfunding is people who've never heard of your product before get to hear about you now, and you get to meet another part of of a target audience. People were very critical of Spike Lee, and what was the other guy? Zach Braff. People were very critical of their Kickstarters, and I never quite understood what the criticism was all about. But pushing that aside, the one thing I did know was it was great for crowdfunding in general, because even though there was maybe a backlash and some criticism, it really exposed that platform to a lot of people, and just they understood it who they may not have understood it before those Kickstarter campaigns. And one thing that's interesting, you can look in your Kickstarter campaign and you can click on the people who backed your project, and you can see what other projects they've backed. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of people that were my backers. They also backed, you mentioned the John August podcast when we were talking earlier. John August has a podcast, Script Notes, and he ran a Kickstarter campaign for they were like playing cards for writers. It was called like a writer emergency pack, and you would pull out these playing cards and they would give you ideas. Anyways, he ran a Kickstarter campaign, and I can see on a lot of the people who donated to mine or contributed to mine, a lot of those people, the only two projects they've contributed to were the John August one and then mine. So I think that there is definitely a synergy sort of amongst, the more people that do it, the more people that are pulled into the system. And those people that contributed to the John August project, they already had an account with Kickstarter. It was very simple for them to then go and just click, oh yeah, I'll contribute to the pinch as well. And so I just think, again, I'm pretty bullish on crowdfunding as well. I think it's only going to grow and get better. And the more people that just get exposed to it, the better off we're all going to be. Yeah, I don't understand, the outrage either. When Spike Lee and Zach Braff, crowdfunding, Kevin Smith was going to crowdfund for Clerks 3, and then he decided, oh, hell no, I'm not going to deal with all this, because he saw the shit that Zach Braff was getting, and he said there's no way in hell that he's going to, raise $1 million on Kickstarter, and then, every other tweet to him is going to be, you're stealing money from me. But, I've had people on my Facebook who were saying, stop giving your money to rich people on Kickstarter. And I don't think they quite see the forest because of the trees. If that makes any sense. You know, I think a lot of it was very ego-driven complaints, like, you know, they're stealing money from me. Like, no, they're not stealing money from you. There's people who donated to that. There's a lot of people who donated to Zach Braff and Spike Lee who will never donate to another project again. Or if they do, they will do so because you know, they got on Kickstarter for the first time. Zach Braff, when he was at one of his screenings, said to him, "Hey, listen, you know, who's here just because of the Kickstarter? Who's never or never been on Kickstarter before?" Because some of those people, they may just start a Kickstarter for one time and just to donate to them, you know, and maybe that'll be the one-off. So, you know, until I could see some actual, you know, financial proof that the person was like, well, I was going to donate $10 to this little independent artist to make a, you know, a graphic novel or whatever, but instead I'm going to give it to Zach Braff. I really don't think that happened.
No, I totally agree. It's not a, you know, there's an express. It's not just, you know, it's not a finite pool. I mean, if people think your project is cool, they'll contribute to it. And it doesn't really matter what other projects they contribute to, within reason, obviously, but I totally agree.
So, you know, one of the questions that came in through Twitter, Ashley, was if you were going to do your Kickstarter again for The Pinch, what are some of the things that you would do differently this time?
Well, first, I just want to mention I did do a podcast episode where I basically just went through, and it's nothing but me talking about sort of the wrap up to my Kickstarter campaign. So maybe I can send you that link and put that in the show notes, and maybe I'll just summarize it here. But that's definitely a more in-depth, and it's like a 45-minute episode where I just go through all the things I did. I would say the main thing I would do differently is more preparation. You know, once I got into and I had these 2 writing assignments. As I said, the one I mentioned in September, which kind of dragged on a little bit, and then I had another one sort of October, November, December, and then I launched my Kickstarter in January. So I was very, very busy those sort of months leading up to it, and that's the thing I would do differently. I would try and clear my schedule at least like a month before the Kickstarter campaign and really think through what content you're going to publish during the campaign, because what I found was, you know, the more content I could put out there during the campaign, the better off I was. The more people shared that content. And maybe it's just a blog post on this, or maybe it's offering a new reward, or maybe it's, you know, a new YouTube video, or maybe it's a new podcast episode, whatever it is. I would just make sure that if I ran a 30-day campaign, almost every single day of that 30-day campaign, I would have some piece of interesting content that I could publish on Twitter, on Facebook, through my email list, something interesting that I could push out to those channels. Again, whether it's a blog post, or maybe it's just a picture, maybe it's a little YouTube video, something that I could publish. What I ended up doing was I just created an extra podcast episode every week where I would just talk to people about how it was going with my Kickstarter campaign, and I would offer some new rewards. And that is really what ultimately I think pushed me through to the end. And I was only my time with my scheduling was I only had really time to produce one extra episode per week where I would really talk about this Kickstarter campaign. And those are all available online, so you can actually go back and listen to those. And those are sort of my thoughts as I was going through it. But again, if I could actually come up, so that's like 4 pieces of content that I was able to produce during the Kickstarter campaign. But if I were to go back and do it again, I would try and produce 30 pieces of content, one interesting piece of content per day for the whole campaign. I would tweet it. I would Facebook it. I would, you know, send it to my email list, and that would just keep people interested, and it would potentially get more people involved. I mean, those people might share it with some of their friends, and so the more content you have, the more chances you have of that content being shared, of getting more people sort of in your circle of influence. So that's the big thing. Maybe it's a long-winded answer, but that's the big thing I would change, is try and have more content to share during the campaign.
Yeah, I have found, you know, people do want to see updates. They do want to see that the project is progressing. You know, a mistake I've seen other people make is they sort of launch the campaign, they get the initial backers, and then they sort of just let it taper off. And then they only come back when it's like, you know, hey, there's 3 days left or whatever. You know, I've helped a lot of other filmmakers out with crowdfunding campaigns, and that's something I've always said is, you got to keep this fervor up for 30 days. You got to, because if you're not excited about it, nobody else is going to be.
I'd be curious to see the statistics on this, and I haven't researched this at all. But one thing that occurred to me, like I had very little money, and this is what I was saying. You know, I had like half my money the first week and half my money the last week, and I would almost like literally the needle barely moved during those middle 2 weeks. And I might even just, if I ran another one, I might just run a 14-day Kickstarter just to make it simpler and more compact. There's something to that urgency, and if you just had 2 weeks, 14 days, it would actually make it easier to run, and you might end up being able to raise the same amount of money. Because as I said, those middle 2 weeks, I didn't raise much money. And I'd be curious to see if anybody has statistics on that, like, hey, do 14-day Kickstarter campaigns, are they more likely to get funded, or maybe they're just as likely to get funded?
I can attest to the bell curve. There definitely is. You will get your most money the first 3 days and the last 3 days. That's usually the norm. Very rarely. I mean, I do know of a few campaigns that all of a sudden got a money drop in the middle of the campaign because some random person loved it and they were like, here's 10 grand. I've been a part of projects like that, and I'm always astonished that people have that much money just to throw around. The 2 week campaign. I'm actually planning one. Listeners of this podcast know I've been planning one for a while. I would next thing I would do though is a graphic novel. I've done different ones for films, stuff like that, but I would actually like to do one for the graphic novel on Kickstarter. And I wouldn't do it for too long. I probably would do it for maybe 2 to 3 weeks just to sort of get it out there. But that's something that as I it always gets moved back because I still have to go through the last draft of the graphic novel script. But how it's always like one thing comes up and you got to push it back. But that is great though, Ashley, that you're able to sort of release that. I'll add in the show notes your podcast where you actually talk about your your Kickstarter and stuff like that. Because again, I always find that we're in this together. So it's sort of like like you were just saying, there isn't like a limited number of resources. You know what I mean? Like that's why if somebody wants to, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I get a lot of people asking me to donate to their crowdfunding campaigns, I get a lot of that. And I don't know if you get that as well. I do. Okay, I just want to make sure. If it's a podcast thing or, but so in closing, Ashley, I know we've been talking for a while. So in closing, Ashley, is there anything that you wanted to maybe discuss? Anything you wanted to say that we can get a chance to, and just to sort of put a period at the end of this whole conversation?
No, I mean, one thing I'm doing, and I'm doing it on my own podcast as well. As I said, I'm shooting July 9th to the 29th. And if anybody listening to your podcast wants to come out and work on the film, there's really no money. It's basically a deferred pay kind of situation. On a $25,000 budget, you queue up how much money there really is. I mean, just the hard cost of the hard drives and, renting a couple locations. So if anybody wants some experience, I'm happy to dole out some credits. If someone wants that second AD credit, I'm happy to do it. So if anybody listening to this podcast is interested, just hit me up. My email is info@sellingyourscreenplay.com. But really any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But if anybody's going to be in LA in July and they want to work on a cool feature film, I'd love to have them.
Cool, and I will also put that in the show notes as well. So anyone listening to this, Ashley's a really cool guy, very knowledgeable guy, and I think the pinch is going to be pretty cool.
So.
If I was out in LA, I would actually come work with you on that. But I'm actually out here in Philadelphia. Rainy, dreary Philadelphia. It's been raining for like 3 days here. So Ashley, where can people find you online?
I'm on Twitter. It's Ashley Meyers, and then my main blog is sellingyourscreenplay.com, and that's just all spelled out, sellingyourscreenplay.com. And you can check out my services. As we've discussed, I publish a weekly podcast, which is obviously free. So that's probably the best way to just kind of learn about what I'm about and kind of just pick and then I interview mostly screenwriters, sometimes screenwriter directors, but it's got a real focus on screenwriting, obviously being the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. And then I also have a free guide, sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. And that's just like a 5-week free guide on how to sell your screenplay. And basically, I just walk people through the process of how I sold a bunch of scripts. And for the most part, I've sold all my scripts without agents and managers. So it's really been me going directly to producers. And I basically walk people through that process in this free guide, sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide.
And he just had Max Landis on his podcast as well. I really recommend everyone check out that episode, because Max Landis has been on a selling spree lately with screenplays, and he just sold Mr. Right, and there was another one he just sold too. So I'm going to link to that in the show notes as well, everybody.
So he's probably the hottest screenwriter in Hollywood right now. But and he's a real interesting character. So I would recommend that episode as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I wonder if he had any connections going into the industry. I can't. I'm going to look into that. I'm going to look.
No, he definitely did. But if you listen to him, it's not a mystery why he's been successful, and I don't think it necessarily has anything to do with his dad. I mean, he just writes a ton, and his ideas are pretty high concept, and he's a pretty good writer. So it's like, yes, he did have some inside track, and that certainly didn't hurt him any. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of kids of famous directors who never had any success. So he's a character, and I think he's worth kind of listening to, because he's passionate about screenwriting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I always try to do is I try to listen to different people, just get different takes on it. And he actually does have some good advice on his Twitter. And he even has a YouTube channel that sometimes he talks about screenwriting. And I think his best strength, honestly, Ashley, is his ability to sell himself. I think he's very personable. When he goes into a room, I think he's probably one of the few guys that executives probably look forward to talking to.
No doubt, because it's always going to be entertaining. It's like you get in a room with him, I can pretty much guarantee you'll be entertained for a little while. Yeah,
exactly. And that's what I think one of his best strengths is the fact that he can sell himself and tell a story about selling himself, and then it's sort of like the screenplay is almost like a second thought. Because I think a lot of these producers and execs actually just want to talk to him in general.
And you know what? That's in any industry, is being able to get in a room and sell yourself and entertain people. That will take you far in any industry and any job that you have.
Yes, I concur. So Ashley, I want to say thank you very much for coming on. Everyone, it's DaveBullis.com. Twitter, it's @Dave_Bullis. Ashley, anytime you want to come back on and talk screenwriting, about selling screenplays, marketing screenplays, I invite you, and honestly, the door is always open.
Perfect, and likewise to you as well. So I really appreciate this, Dave.
Oh, my pleasure, my friend. I will talk to you soon.
Thank you. We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Find Dave at davebullis.com. Please make sure to subscribe and share the podcast.